First, thanks for the opportunity to present some of our work here. I would start by adding a subtitle to this, which is also relevant for the context of the talk, but at the same time is a reflection of the translational component of our research. Emotional memories. Now there is plenty of anecdotal and scientific evidence that we tend to have better memory for emotional events. And we and others have contributed to the literature by providing evidence also related to the neural mechanisms associated with the memory enhancing effect of emotion. Now, emotion does not enhance all aspects of memory, and one of the unclear issue that is emerging in the literature is related to the effect of emotion on relational memory, or memory for contextual details that are part of emotional events, with the idea that in this particular case, there is evidence that there is an impairment of memory for such contextual details. And this is particularly relevant in the context of PTSD, where there is evidence suggesting that reduced and detrimental relational memory might be related and might be central to generating and maintaining symptoms of hypervigilance and hyperarousal. The basic idea here is that the increased arousal of emotional events at the time of experience of those traumatic events leads to non-specific, decontextualized encoding of information, which then later on leads to non-specific retrieval of those memories, even to cues that are not even emotional, related to the context of the place, the context of those traumatic events. And this then, in turn, leads to maintain symptoms of hypervigilance and hyperarousal. Now, the bad thing about this is also that while those memories, those decontextualized, those non-specific memories are retrieved, then they are also re-encoded in a non-specific, decontextual ways, and then that contributes to the maintenance of this vicious cycle. Now, related to this, and given the evidence in the literature on healthy functioning, we try to address here two main questions. So first, does the high emotional arousal enhance or impair relational memory in healthy functioning? And what can we do to promote memory recontextualization, maybe, and also to increase resilience and well-being? Starting with the first aspect, again, there is evidence of enhanced memory by emotion related to memory for items. But the evidence regarding the impact on relational memory is rather mixed. While we have several reports of memory impairments by emotion, in others we have evidence that emotion also enhances relational memory, not only item memory. And then of course there might be different reasons for this, including related to the specific experimental manipulation, to the specific type of stimuli that are being involved and memory is tested for, and also related to different aspects, contextual aspects that are being considered. Now, just to provide an example here of how a task can be used, a manipulation can be used in order to identify these differential effects of emotion or item and relational memory, participants are presented with pictures that are used as backgrounds on which then different items, emotional and neutral, are presented. And then later on, memory is tested for both the items and their relations, their link to the background images. And the evidence shows that memory is enhanced for items when they are emotional, but then memory is impaired for the relational memory for those emotional items. And then the basic idea is that emotional information captures attention, which then leads to increased processing of those items, and better memory later on, but this increased processing happens at the expense of memory for the associated contextual details and hence reduced relational memory. Another aspect that I would like to emphasize in this context, which we consider in our research, is the dissociation between subjective and objective relational memory. Why? Because we and others provide evidence that emotion actually enhances subjective relational memory, as measured with the remember-know paradigm. So for instance, in this context, instead of having participants just respond with old and new responses, they would also be asked to distinguish in making their responses between responses that are based on the ability to recollect, to remember specific contextual details from the time of encoding, or they would just be able to make these responses based on familiarity, based on knowing that they have seen those items during encoding, but without being able to recollect this specific contextual aspect. So again, this would be an example of subjective relational memory. But then the idea is to also test it and compare with the effect of emotion on what would be, in this particular case, objective relational memory. And this is what we had in our implementation to see if we can find reconciling evidence related to these discrepant findings in the literature. So for this, participants were presented with stimuli with both a foreground and a background component. And the stimuli were produced in a way that this integration of the foreground and the background information would be more naturalistic in order to increase ecological validity. And importantly, related to the green lines, distinguishing between the foreground and the background, those lines were not presented on the actual pictures when the participants were presented with this stimuli, but they are rather presented here for illustration purposes. And however, this dissociation between the foreground and the background was validated in a separate study on a different sample. Now, because the basic idea of these differential effects of emotion is that has at the center the role of attention, then in our study we also involved manipulation of attention, so that participants were presented on a trial-by-trial basis with cues about where to orient their attention, to the foreground or the background of the pictures. And then critically, we also recorded eye tracking data. So again, this allowed us to investigate different effects of emotion linked to attentional manipulation. Now, during retrieval, we also tested both subjective and objective relational memory. And the items were presented on a screen. Participants had to provide responses based on recollection versus familiarity. And the subjective relational memory was indexed by accurate recollection-based responses. And then we also had a measure of objective relational memory indicated by accurate identification of matches. So then this design was critical because then we can address questions about different aspects of relational memory, subjective, objective independently, and also to see if there is a link between them related to the effect of emotion. And what did we find? And before that, I would like to emphasize some manipulation checks. So first, eye tracking data showed that participants follow the instructions, so we know where the eyes go. When instructed to focus on foreground, they looked more at the foreground of the pictures, less at the background, and the other way around. They paid more attention to the background when they instructed to do so. Now, another aspect related to this manipulation check is linked to evidence that provides an initial clue about using this emotion, this manipulation of attention as an emotion regulation strategy. And as we can see here, we see a difference in the way participants experienced these pictures depending on where they pay attention to. If the focus was on emotional aspects, on the foreground of the emotional pictures, then they experienced increased emotional responses associated with increased ratings. And consistent with the idea of using focused attention as an emotional regulation strategy, then we see a reduction in ratings when participants focus away from the emotional content. So again, this provides a clear indication that participants are performing the task in a way that is requested, and this has an impact on the experienced associated emotions. What about memory? We found evidence for an enhancement of subjective relational memory. As we can see here, the highest level of performance was associated with recollection-based responses for emotional pictures, for emotional items, when the focus was on the emotional content. Moreover, when this increased accuracy at the subjective level was confirmed by objective accuracy, then again we see a boost in relational memory. So at this point we have evidence not of impaired relational memory by emotion, but an enhancement in this particular condition, when in terms of memory slang, we have a separate assessment of subjective relational memory and its confirmation by objective. So we have the hit situation, which is also driven by recollection-based responses and by the focus on the emotional components. What about evidence related to the impact of emotion on objective relational memory? In this particular case, even though overall we had increased performance in the relational memory for emotional items, this was actually driven by the focus on contextual details, by the background focus. And this goes back to the idea that by focusing on those contextual aspects while processing emotional information helps participants to keep the memories together, the item and the associated context together, contextualized as opposed to decontextualized in a case of an impairing effect of emotion on relational memory, which also, again, has relevance for understanding changes associated with PTSD. Now, related to this detrimental effect of emotion, we see that this is relative. In a case of focusing on the emotional components, then we have reduced memory for emotional stimuli, but overall, we still have an advantage of memory compared to the neutral when we look at the same corresponding conditions for the neutral stimuli. So then this points to the fact that we see effects that go beyond and above those associated with the attentional manipulation. Nevertheless, for the purpose of using focused attention as an emotion regulation strategy, it's important to emphasize the fact that indeed, if in a voluntary way we pay attention to the context, then it's more likely that we're going to keep those memories together, which also raises the possibility that we might be able to recontextualize our memories by having such focus on contextual, non-emotional aspects. And this is another thing to keep in mind. So to summarize, we find evidence that the reconciled mixed reports in the literature emotionally enhances subjective relational memory separately and when confirmed by accurate objective relational memory. We see evidence consistent with an impairment of objective relational memory when tested separately without accounting for subjective relational memory. And in this context, also with the translational relevance, focusing on contextual aspects of emotional events enhances objective relational memory, possibly by diminishing memory decontextualization. And then again, this is another clue about possible relevance of focused attention as an emotional regulation strategy to target in training to promote memory recontextualization. Now, this is important because not only we address issues in the literature related to basic effects of emotion on different aspects of memory, but we also identify possible evidence for possible translational relevance. Now, when we think about PTSD, then it's also important to demonstrate that such an emotion regulation strategy works not only with external stimuli, but also with internal stimuli, right? Because after all, these patients are dealing with memories about traumatic events. So then the idea, before implementing any training, the idea is that we need to test and demonstrate that focused attention also works with recollected memories. And that's what we also did. So then the idea is not to pay attention to external aspects, but on the mental representation of recollected autobiographical memories, the idea is to have shifts in the attentional focus from aspects that are most emotional, in this particular case, to other non-emotional contextual details. For instance, were any people present there? Were they police or firefighters? Where did this happen? Was this a rural area, or it was in the middle of a big city, and so on and so forth? So then the idea is to also engage this emotion regulation strategy with these internal representations of memories for traumatic events. And then that's exactly what we did. So the short answer to this question is that yes, we have evidence for effectiveness of focused attention with recollected memories, and we also provided evidence related to neural mechanisms. So similar to a reduction in the experienced emotion when focusing away from the emotional aspects of pictures, where we see a reduction in the emotional ratings, we see a reduction in the emotional ratings of re-experienced autobiographical memories. And importantly, this difference was observed in the absence of differences in other aspects of those memories, such as reliving and vividness. We also have brain imaging evidence related to the effectiveness of engaging focused attention with autobiographical recollection. And similar to studies of emotion regulation, typically we have two types of regions targeted: regions associated with cognitive emotion control, such as medial and lateral PFC, prefrontal cortical areas, and regions associated with emotion, basic emotion processing, such as the amygdala. And as we can see here on the left side, when focusing away from the emotional aspects and on the contextual aspects, then we see increased activity in medial and lateral regions of the brain, linked to processing internal and external stimuli respectively. And related to that, we see decreased responses in the amygdala when, again, focusing away from the emotional aspects and on contextual details, further validating the effectiveness of focused attention as an emotional regulation strategy. Interestingly, in both cases, we also see increased response in regions associated with processing of contextual details, such as parahippocampal place area, again, when participants were focusing away from the emotional aspects and on non-emotional contextual details. So at this point, we were ready with this evidence related to the effectiveness of focused attention as an emotional regulation strategy. We were ready to implement this as a training strategy, which brings us to the second part of the presentation. Now, if we talk about the goals of training in general, cognitive training, then the idea is to try and implement behavioral changes that will also eventually be implemented at the level of the brain. So we capitalize, the idea is to capitalize on the brain's plasticity. And the idea is that with training, we expect changes in the brain at the level of functions and at the level of structure. What about the goal related to increasing resilience? Now, in this particular case, our approach was also guided by findings that indeed both neural and behavioral factors of resilience actually contribute to providing protection against symptoms of distress, such as anxiety and depression. And relevant for the present talk is the role of emotion regulation as factors of resilience. So then the idea is to, having this in mind, the idea is then to implement a program that leads to the implementation of emotion regulation skills, and then to also investigate possible changes at the neural level. But what else might be relevant in this context? Because similar to other trainings, the eventual ultimate goal, ideally, is to also see changes not only related to the specific training that is implemented, but also related, ideally, to other aspects that are more domain general. And based on data from another study, self-efficacy is emerging as a factor of protection against symptoms of distress, and therefore we also wanted to pay attention, particular attention to this aspect in our training. So we implemented an emotion regulation training in student veterans. And why? Because they have specific challenges in general associated with their transition from military to civilian life, and also because some of them experience symptoms of dysregulation, some suffering from PTSD, and therefore we wanted to find a training regime that might work and help with their challenges. Now, student veterans tend to have the feeling of rustiness because they had a break in their education. They have challenges associated with fitting in. Some of them, again, might also need to deal with disability. And they also have different experiences. While this might be a typical context where regular students socialize, this would be a context during their training and maybe when they get to get a little bit of rest in a case of student veterans. This might not be unusual for a typical student. On the other hand, student veterans might need to carry the burden of their losses. So then it was important to us to come up with a training program that would help student veterans. And aside from our training, focusing on emotion regulation, we also had a control training focusing on broad social-emotional skills. In both cases, we had a similar overall design with a training intervention preceded and followed by assessments at the brain and behavioral level, and also clinical assessments. But what did we do in terms of specific emotion regulation strategies? Based on our evidence about the effectiveness of focused attention, we decided to pair that with another emotion regulation strategy, cognitive reappraisal. Why? Because one size does not fit all. And in the context of different emotion regulation strategies that one might use in dealing with adversity and dealing with challenging situations, it was important to combine these. And focused attention can be deployed much faster, and therefore it can act earlier in the process of generating emotional responses. And then it was important to couple this with cognitive reappraisal, which, even though it's engaged more slowly, it can also lead to reinterpretation and reframing of situations and associated responses, with a view of making changes and reappraising the situations and the causes and the consequences through more positive lenses, rosier glasses. And because we identified effectiveness with focused attention with both internal and external stimuli, we implemented a similar way with cognitive reappraisal. This is just an example of how they were implemented with both pictures and recollected memories. And here is what we found. Now, consistent with improvements at the level of cognitive control, executive control, we found evidence for enhanced executive function following emotion control training. And this was reflected in increased reaction time and accuracy in a standardized working memory task. Importantly, this was specific to the emotion regulation training, and it was not observed in a control group. Similarly, we found evidence for increased general self-efficacy following emotion control, consistent with a potential transfer to a more domain general aspects of processing, again, specifically associated with emotion regulation training. We also saw changes at the level of resting state functional connectivity, again, based on targeting regions associated with basic emotion processing, the amygdala, and regions associated with cognitive control of emotion, the LPFC in this particular case. And just to orient you a little bit, blue indicates decreases in a functional connectivity, and red indicates increases in a functional connectivity. So in this particular case, for instance, on the left side, we identified decreases in a functional connectivity of the amygdala and these midline PFC structures. And also, double lines indicate that such effects are observed for both groups, whereas solid lines, such as this one, and most of the ones associated with increases in a functional connectivity, indicate that the effects were either specific to the emotion regulation group or they were stronger. So overall, this evidence is consistent with reduced bottom-up influences from emotion processing and perceptual areas, which were coupled with increased crosstalk among cognitive control brain regions as expected as a result of emotion regulation training. So to summarize, in the first part, we provided evidence that reconciles findings in the literature regarding the effect of emotion on relational memory and points to focused attention as potentially effective in memory recontextualization. Findings from the emotion regulation training provide evidence, promising evidence that such tools can be learned, and they allow adaptive changes at both behavioral and neural levels. Interestingly, we identified changes that were more specific to the type of training, and also changes that are associated with more general aspects of processing. Now, on a side note, interestingly, these factors related to executive control, cognitive control in general, and self-efficacy are also critical in dealing with challenges associated with the current pandemic. So having evidence that such aspects can also be trained provides very promising findings that this is something that can be implemented at a larger scale. In future research, we're interested in exploring possible differential effects of these emotion regulation strategies, and we're also currently expanding the training effectiveness to other groups. On this note, I'm going to conclude by acknowledging the contribution of many people, and also thanking for the financial support. And thank you very much. I would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Florin, for the great talk. We've got time for probably about one or two questions, if anybody from the audience has any questions. Does anyone have a question?
If no one else does, then I'll pipe up. Thanks very much. That was really interesting and a very compelling story, I think. I just wanted to come back to one small element, which is the distinction between the subjective relational memory and the objective relational memory. So as you're probably aware, there's been a lot of controversy about the use of the remember no paradigm and whether it might be, really just a kind of bias shift as opposed to an actually a different kind of memory. How much would that change the story? Your story, do you think, if the remember no, what's being indexed there is not really a different kind of memory, but it's just a different criterion on memory?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. And to clarify this, actually, I also had discussions with Boris Moskovich at the University of Toronto, with Neil Cohen related to these aspects. I don't think it's a different kind of memory. I would rather say that it's a different way of assessing more subtle aspects related to relational memory. And when we do that, then we see that we find evidence that is also consistent with what we see in real life situations, right? Because we can have instances where we are actually quite right, not when we remember aspects of our past, emotional aspects, and we're also able to remember specific details. So then it bugged me, it bugged us that we see actually an impairment. And indeed, in more extreme circumstances, or when we test relational memory, without accounting for these more subtle aspects, subjective aspects of relational memory, then we have evidence that is consistent with an impairment. Although, again, the way I was showing, depending on whether you consider aspects that are specifically related to attentional or goes beyond attention, even that story might be slightly different. But overall, what excites us is the fact that when our recollection, feeling of recollection, based on this subjective assessment of our memories, is confirmed by the objective, then we actually see what is consistent with anecdotal evidence of having increased relational memory for emotional events. And that's why I think it's important to have such subtle dissociation considered when looking at the data. And of course, there are other aspects that still need to be investigated. So to me and to us in general, I don't think we can definitely conclude the way others might be inclined to do, that in all instances, relational memory is impaired by the emotional aspects. I think we have to pay attention to more than just one type of evidence. And at this point, I think the evidence at best is mixed. And I hope that this evidence based on our task manipulation is compelling in showing that at the very least we have to look at different aspects and really have an understanding of when and in what circumstances emotion enhances or impairs relational memory.
Thank you. We might have time for one quick question, if anybody has one. I'll ask just a quick question. Are you familiar with Deborah Talmey's recent model of how emotion affects memory, the computational model?
Yeah, and actually I attended her poster presentation. What is the question?
Well, yeah. Well, what I was just going to ask is, I'm just curious as to how your work fits into it, because so she has this model within the temporal context model that posits that emotion enhances the binding between an item and context. And I'm just curious if, you know, some of the evidence you've described, you know, mostly accords with that, or does it disagree with that? Or, yeah, I'm just curious as to what your take on it is.
So as far as I know, actually, there is more recent evidence that the temporal aspects seem to be enhanced by emotion. So then again, this fits into the discussion of considering different aspects, contextual aspects. Is it about the time? Is it about the place? Is it about the complexity? Is it about this binding? So that's why I think we are only at the beginning in terms of figuring things out. And this is an example where just providing subtlety related to things that we have evidence that they are happening in real life situations, then we see that the story is slightly different. Now, is this going to be applied when the same subtlety is applied to other contextual details, such as related to the time, related to the location, and so on and so forth? We don't know. I just want to stay away from conclusions such as those that we've seen in the literature, that you see only impairing effects and that's the definite answer. I think there is more to this, and this is just an example where when you consider other aspects, contextual aspects, that are part of these relations, then the story is very likely to be more nuanced.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's all thank our speaker again. I know the Zoom applause is not the most riveting form of applause. I apologize. But now it's